Hello, my name is Ettore. I am a virologist and I'm working at the Friedrich Micha Institute, FMI in Basel, Switzerland. And I'm really happy that today we're going to talk about such important topic that's pandemics. So the title of the presentation is Viruses, What Will the Next Pandemic Be? So, so what you can learn from this presentation, I hope that at the end of this presentation, you're going to be able to understand what a pandemic is. You're going to discover important pandemics, learn why some viruses they have a greater pandemic potential than others, discover which viruses could be the next pandemic. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to quickly talk about how to avoid and be ready for the next pandemic. So what is a pandemic? A pandemic is a disease occurring worldwide, cross international boundaries, and usually affecting a large number of people. A pandemic can be a new emerging infectious disease, meaning a new disease, or a disease that already exists, but is rapidly spreading. The concept of pandemic is intrinsically associated with immunity and how contagious a disease is. But I'm going to talk about it in the next slides. And you might have heard about the Spanish and Hong Kong flu, Ebola, Zika, MERS, and SARS coronavirus. They are all examples of viruses that already caused pandemics. In talking about it, so I just want to tell in the next slide about the history of some pandemics of this millennium. And in 2002, 2003, the SARS coronavirus 1 infected around 8,000 people and killed around 700 people. So almost 10% of the affected people died because of SARS coronavirus 1. Then in 2009 and 10, we had the swine flu with more than 200,000 people dying because of this influenza. We had in 2014-16 a pandemic caused by Ebola with around 30,000 people infected and more than 11,000 people dying because of this Ebola, affected many countries in Africa. We had in 2015-16 the Zika virus pandemic with 1.5 million cases of Zika virus. Interestingly, Zika doesn't usually kill the infected person, but it can cause a chronic disease. And now we are facing, the biggest pandemic of this millennium. That's the SARS coronavirus 2 that I checked recently, and more than 3 million people already died because of this disease. So what is the pandemic potential virus, and why some viruses have greater pandemic potential than others? So as I said before, this is associated with population immunity, because when a population, people don't have a previous immunity against a virus, then this virus can infect, in theory, everybody in the population that is susceptible. And usually this happens with new viruses, or if a virus already exists, this virus can mutate or rearrange in order to escape the immunity. And this happens usually with the viruses that have high mutation rates, and mainly with RNA virus, because RNA mutates faster than DNA. Also, viruses, they have pandemic potential when they are highly contagious, when they can be transmitted easily from an infected person to other people that get in touch with this person. This typical example of this is like when a virus is transmitted by air, for example. And zoonotic viruses are usually the ones that cause pandemics, because they meaning that a virus comes from an animal where it is adapted to infect these animals, and it can jump to a human and then transmit from human to human eventually. And this happens because if it's adapted to animals, it has mutations for that, that makes it adapted to animals. And once it jumps to humans, usually we don't have any immunity against this virus because it's a new virus. Then the virus can spread. So we have to keep an eye on all viruses transmitted by animals, like transmitted by monkeys, transmitted by wild animals like bats, or they have mosquitoes as a vector. There is a list of priority diseases or diseases that need our attention because they can be the next pandemic. And as a virologist, I have selected 5 viruses that could be the next pandemic based on what they are causing recently and their genetic potential of being a pandemic virus. So maybe the influenza is going to be the next pandemic. As I said, influenza already caused, pandemics before, the most emblematic one being the 1918 Spanish flu. And we might be, or you might be familiar with the symptoms that are caused by influenza that are, muscle pain, or body aches, but coughing and sneezing being maybe the most typical ones. And influenza, when it's not the seasonal, but like the pandemic one, it can have really high fatality rates, up to like 50%. Influenza, as I said, is a zoonotic virus. It's transmitted usually by birds or pigs to humans. It has, the natural host being aquatic birds. And recently also bats were reported to have influenza viruses, but we still don't know about the pandemic potential of these bat influenza viruses. Influenza is an RNA virus, so has high mutation rates and also has more than one segment. It has actually 8 segments that can mix or reassort to produce new viruses that we don't have immunity for. It's highly transmissible because it's transmitted by air, by air droplets. And even though we do have vaccines against influenza, but they are against the seasonal influenza virus, we need a vaccine that could prevent against a new virus or like a pandemic virus. So we need a research for the development of a universal vaccine. There are several antiviral therapeutics, some being more efficient to some strains than others. Influenza actually affects so many countries that it's difficult to predict which country could be the one that could originate this pandemic virus. It could be in Asia, Europe, or America. But maybe the next pandemic is an Ebola virus. Ebola causes, a severe disease. Maybe the most typical symptom being the gastrointestinal symptoms that are caused by Ebola. This like bleeding, diarrhea, and vomiting. It has really high fatality rates, usually over 50%, being as high as 90%. Ebola is also a zoonotic virus transmitted from wild animals to humans, mainly from bats or monkeys to humans. Caused an outbreak, a pandemic in 2014-16, with many countries in Africa being affected and more than 30 people being infected with influenza, with the Ebola virus. It's also highly contagious and can be transmitted by body fluids from infected person to susceptible people. It has 4 viruses, so a pandemic could be caused by any of these 4 Ebola viruses. And even though there is no available vaccine, there are 2 licensed Ebola vaccines that could be or have the potential to be used in case of pandemic, for example. Since the last pandemic, we also have an antibody treatment, antibody cocktail that could actually be used in people that are infected and they are progressing to a severe disease. If a pandemic would be caused by Ebola, it could originate mainly from Africa because many African countries reported to have the wild animals viruses. So it could come, for example, from Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and others. The third potential pandemic virus that I highlight here is the Nipah virus. Maybe you have heard or not, but Nipah is appearing more as a dangerous virus, mainly in Africa, in Asian countries. It causes, besides normal virus-related symptoms, the most characteristic for Nipah is encephalitis. It means inflammation of the brain. It has also a high fatality rate between 40 and 75%. Nipah is also a zoonotic virus transmitted from infected bats to humans or bats to pigs, then to humans. In India, in 2018, it caused 90% death in a small outbreak that we had in India. 19 people infected and 17 people died because of Nipah virus. It is transmitted by coughing because it's transmitted by secretions in saliva. And there is no treatment and no vaccine against Nipah, so it would be really difficult to control in case Nipah, transmits from human to human more easily. But I read and I checked that there is some clinical trials in progress against the Nipah virus. We need, to develop further. If Nipah would be the next pandemic, then it would most likely originate from Asia, because there's where we have recently cases being reported, mainly from Bangladesh, India, Malaysia, Singapore, for example. But maybe the next pandemic is caused by chikungunya. Chikungunya causes a disease that affects mainly the joints, causing joint pain and swelling, as you can see in the picture. What is interesting is that chikungunya usually doesn't kill an infected person, but it can cause a chronic disease. So the person infected by this disease, and they have symptoms. This person might have complications for many months or even years that can compromise the daily tasks and even work. Chikungunya is also zoonotic disease. It's actually a droplet-borne virus because it's transmitted from monkeys to humans through a vector. There's a mosquito vector. In 2017 and 18, we had outbreaks of chikungunya, and there is no vaccine and no treatment for chikungunya virus. If a disease epidemic would be caused by chikungunya, it would most likely come from South America, like Brazil, reported yearly some cases, Africa, like Nigeria and Cameroon, Asia, Thailand, and India. And lastly, maybe the next pandemic is a yellow fever pandemic. Yellow fever causes muscle pain, headache, vomiting, but most emblematically cause bleeding in some organs and liver damage or liver failure. So that's why some patients have, yellow eyes. It has a really high fatality rates as well, between 20 and 50%. It's also zoonotic virus being transmitted from monkeys to humans, having mosquito as a vector. Brazil in 2016 reported over 2,000 cases of Zika yellow fever virus. And even though there is a vaccine, this vaccine is quite efficient against yellow fever, this vaccine is not available everywhere. So we would need to make this vaccine production ready for the next pandemic. And there is no treatment for yellow fever. So once a person is infected, the treatment is usually just based on the symptoms. If yellow fever would be the next pandemic, it would originate most likely from South America in countries like Brazil, Africa like Kenya, Uganda, in Asia from India and Thailand. So how can we be ready and avoid the next pandemic? So we should avoid deforestation, because destroying the forest make the wild animals be in closer contact to cities and to humans, and be able to transmit the virus and other diseases. We should stop wildlife trafficking, because besides that being a crime, it also makes the closer contact between the wild animals and humans. We should fight poverty, because poverty is a way that in a way helps transmission of disease, because of the conditions, lack of hygiene, the sanitary conditions as well, proliferation of some vectors like rats and some mosquitoes as well. We should promote hygiene, because then we can avoid being infected. Increase education, so we know how the viruses are transmitted and how to avoid it. And we should invest in science, because scientists are the ones that are going to produce new vaccines and treatments against pandemic viruses. With that, I finish my presentation. I'd like to thank FMI, the place I work, my grant, the ERC, and thank the NanoTalk group and you for listening, and I'm open for questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your talk, Ettore. There are already so many questions coming in. I will start with a first question, a general one. You have told us a lot about viruses, and people are wondering if bacteria could also cause pandemics, and maybe what are the main differences in how we combat bacteria and viruses.
Hi, yeah. So I highlighted viruses because the talk was more focused on viruses. But the biggest pandemic ever in history was actually caused by bacteria, was the Yersinia pestis that caused the plague. That's actually true. That killed more than 200 million people. So much more than the biggest pandemic caused by a virus that was a Spanish flu that killed around 50 million people. So yeah, bacteria can also cause pandemic. But luckily we have antibiotics, and antibiotics are usually a broad spectrum, so they can fight many different bacteria, many species of bacteria based on what they share in common. So it's different from virus. Like for virus, you have to have vaccines that are specific for this virus. While for bacteria, we have antibiotics that can fight many kinds of bacteria. So it's nowadays, I would say it's a bit more unlikely to have pandemics caused by virus like we had with Yersinia pestis for the plague, for example. But we have to be really aware that many bacteria now are being more resistant or becoming more resistant to some antibiotics. And this is a huge problem now, for example, for some sexually transmitted disease like gonorrhea and chlamydia. Some species or some variants of these species, they are becoming a bit more resistant, and then the antibiotics are not going to work against these bacteria anymore. And then we have to go to alternative treatments. Yeah, so they can also spread and cause kind of epidemics. But real pandemics, I think that virus, they have the greatest potential.
I see. So resistant bacteria could be a big problem, but viruses are maybe likelier to end in a pandemic, or to be the one starting a pandemic. Um, People are wondering how maybe viruses can mutate and not cause global pandemics like SARS-CoV-1 did.
Yes, we were lucky not to have a pandemic caused by SARS-CoV-1 because SARS-CoV-1, as I said, it affected around 8,000 people, so it was considered a pandemic already, but it was contained quicker because it kills around 10% of the infected people. So comparing the mortality rate of SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 is a huge difference. SARS-CoV-2 kills around 2 or 3 per 100, so it's 3%. No, actually, even a bit less than that. People some say between 1 to 3%, while the SARS-CoV-1 killed around 10% of infected people. So because it was much more severe disease, it was, also people developed the symptoms earlier than SARS-CoV-2. We could actually track the infected people earlier and isolate these people. So that's how it didn't become a huge pandemic like we have the SARS-CoV-2. That we have, the incubation time for SARS-CoV-2 is a bit longer, so people don't have huge symptoms in the beginning, so they can spread the disease much easier. And also the mortality rate is a bit lower. Something also that I would like to comment is that some viruses, they even cause pandemic, like SARS-CoV-2 cause pandemic now. They can become non-pandemic after some point if they adapt, if they suffer some mutations that make them, like not a problem anymore. They're not going to kill people anymore. They're going to just cause some like mild symptoms. This has happened, for example, with the Spanish flu. There was H1N1. It caused pandemic and it devastated 50 million people. But after some point, it mutated and got more adapted to people. And now we are infected still with the Spanish flu, with H1N1, but this became the seasonal flu. So it doesn't cause a mortal pandemic anymore. It just causes, mild symptoms. And this can happen also with SARS-CoV-2.
Okay, that's very interesting. So actually, the pandemics we are more afraid of, so to say, are not the very aggressive ones because they kind of that we can control them faster, and they're not also the ones that are really not dangerous because they're not dangerous. So it's something in the middle. Now, we're talking about a very important topic and very current topic, but there's another one, and that would be climate change. And people are wondering if climate change can have an impact on pandemics, and maybe that they can spread better, or that they're going to be more. Someone mentioned the melting of permafrost, maybe letting viruses out.
Yeah, I think this question is very interesting. It's really hard to answer because this is happening, like recently. I mean, the last century, I would say so, like where we can notice this climate change, change the climate to make it a bit more warm. And this has changed already the potential of some countries to also spread some disease that before they could not. Now we have, for example, USA in some European countries that they have now some vectors of some of the disease that I commented before. Some diseases are caused, for example, by a mosquito, transmitted by a mosquito. So they are virus transmitted by mosquito. And these mosquitoes now, because of the climate change, they can go to areas that before were too cold for them because they are usually from warm areas, So maybe now USA is reporting more arthropod-borne viruses, virus transmitted by arthropods like mosquitoes and some ticks, so tick-borne disease, for example. So and therefore I can say that this virus that before they would be more epidemic and cause more symptoms in people from tropical areas. These viruses now they can spread also to subtropical areas because these areas are becoming warm as well. So the climate change is impacting the distribution of some vectors that can spread some disease that were before not able to be transmitted in these areas. Regarding melting of the ice, for example, this can indeed bring to life some bacteria, for sure, because some bacteria, they can transmit disease by themselves. For viruses, it's a more complicated situation. Viruses only live inside hosts. If we have, for example, viruses that are frozen in an area, they should be protected inside the host. Otherwise, for example, RNAs, they are not so stable. Even RNA viruses, they are not so stable to the point that they can survive for hundreds of years in ice. So I think it would be unlikely. You can maybe detect some RNA viruses in melted ice, but it would be unlikely they would be intact enough to actually transmit to people or contaminate people. So I think the melting of the ice would be more important for bacteria and maybe for some DNA viruses. Yes, and indeed we have a DNA virus because I only said about RNA because I think they are the ones mutated fast and they are more problematic. But we had already a pandemic caused by DNA virus, was the smallpox. They also kill millions of people. So we have to be aware that DNA can also cause pandemics, and some DNA can appear from melted ice. But I think it's more unlikely than bacteria should cause pandemic.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really interesting all that you have to say. We just have so many questions, so we kind of have to go on so that everyone gets the answer they want. I wanted to ask, so we have, like you have named a few reasons why maybe we are now going to have more often pandemics. What are ways to prevent them? Where should the research go? And maybe what are the differences that you think are significant? We see that different countries make different decisions and they lead to different results.
Yeah, I mean, we had a great talk about mRNA vaccine, and this is a revolution because now we can make vaccines much quicker than before. In 3 to 4 months, you can already have a vaccine that can be tested in some clinical phases. And many people are skeptical about it because they say, wow, coronavirus vaccine came in less than 1 year, while vaccines usually take 5 years to be ready. This used to be true, but nowadays we have technologies that can make vaccines much faster. So this is a way that we can be ready for the next pandemic, is being prepared for produce vaccines faster. And also, for example, for influenza, I said, we have to have universal vaccines because some viruses like influenza, they mutate so quickly that vaccine has to be produced every year, for a different strain. But there is a way to produce universal vaccines if we actually target really well conserved proteins in viruses. So this has to be a focus of research as well. So I think that's the way you can get prepared, invest in science. Yes, and also being educated about how viruses can be transmitted, because as I said, most of these pandemics are caused by zoonotic viruses. So avoiding contact with these animals is a way also to avoid the transmission from wild animals to humans. But once it's transmitted already, then you have to be ready with vaccines and therapies.
You talked about research. Is it also does it also make sense to spend money on research on anticipating the next pandemic, or do you think that? Can you hear me? Okay, it seems like we have a problem with the sound.
Okay, now it looks it's back.
Okay. All right. I was asking, is it worth it to spend money on research to anticipate the next pandemic, or do you think that this is something that is too random, so to say, to invest money in, and we should invest more money in like making vaccines or things like that?
Well, I mean, the answer for this question as a scientist is easy. We do have to invest money, and we can really prevent pandemics to happen. For example, for coronavirus, we had the SARS-CoV-1, and vaccines started to be developed, but they totally stopped, the production of vaccines, or actually more the testing of the vaccines stopped after the SARS-CoV-1 because it was gone quite quicker, because all the reasons as I said. But like we know, as I said, we have some potential viruses that can cause the next pandemic, like the Nipah. There is no vaccine yet. I mean, some vaccines are being made, but they are still in clinical trials. What if Nipah would come right now? We would not be prepared for it. So we can indeed be ready for pandemics if we invest in development of vaccines before the pandemic already comes. Because some viruses, they are conserved enough that if you produce a vaccine right now, we can be ready for the next pandemic. Some viruses, they mutate much faster, like influenza virus. So then you have to invest in a new type of vaccine that would be the universal vaccine. This is possible to be done, and we still are not ready. We're still not ready. We still don't have it. So we have a large amount of area in science that can be invested to prevent new pandemics.
Okay, so your opinion is to invest in everything that we know, and then when a new plague comes, we have a place to start. That's what you're saying.
Yes, but you don't have to prepare specific for one virus as well. Like you can also prepare for the technology. For example, the mRNA vaccine is a technology that can be used against many viruses, and because it's really, you can do it much faster. So invest in science in a way that you can also invest in technology per se, you can actually make things much faster. So yeah, that's actually my answer as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much for your talk and for answering our questions.